Alright, so here we go. We're looking at doing basically an endocrown. We've got a pretty severely broken down tooth. Mesiobuccal cusp nearly gone through. Linguals are under reduced. I've gone ahead and done the orifice barrier and blocked out any undercuts with some resin. And now we're going to simply remove the unsupported cusps here down to usually minimum 2 millimeters. In this case, we're taking it down to where it's not very well supported. There's a lot of these, you'll see them just completely flat topped. You don't necessarily have to do that. There's more than one way to do these. Typically I'm taking it down to where there's enough thickness in the structure that we can get this nice broad shoulders, how most of these designs are done. This is one of my favorite burrs to use for this. You must be very careful interproximally with it. It is incredibly aggressive. But it does make short work of tooth structure. Basically just making a flat land area that's going to add a lot of vertical resistance form. And we're going to come and smooth this down. Again, if that cusp were intact, then I wanted to maintain the majority of that structure. I could have a step there as long as I still had my 2 millimeter reduction. In this case, we went ahead and included it to make it more stereotypical for an endocrown design. But I'll see if I can show you another one later that I did leave the step there just to conserve tooth structure. We'll look at that on a scanned CEREC image here on the next file. Otherwise, we're just creating that nice land area again. If I don't have to push this subgingival, I'm not going to. I'll prefer it to be super gingival. Then we're going to blend this in. There was a little bit of tooth structure in between the box and then that internal chamber there. It was going to be too thin to mill it, so we've gone ahead and just dropped that structure down in between there just a little bit. But nice flat structure, creating a nice sharp defined margin and making something that's very easy for the machine to mill. And instead of relying on external retention, we're going to do internal retention. I typically look to do these when I've lost some of the peripheral enamel. That I can't just rely on adhesive dentistry very reliably, that I want some mechanical resistance. In this case, we're going to go 2-3 millimeters or so down as my preferred depth. Research is kind of all over the place as to what's the best. Up to 4 millimeters I've seen fairly positive, and as little as 1.5 in some studies. So 2 to 3 is probably a pretty good place to be, to help with some of that resistance form. It's pretty straightforward to do. You peck down to about 2-3 millimeters with this broad, flat ended tapered burr. And then you just create that ideal taper form. If you lock your wrist, you can keep this pretty ideal at a 6-degree taper or so with a nice flat floor. Pretty straightforward. And then we'll come about and just start smoothing the periphery, just blending everything into your box areas, making sure it's nice and smooth, transitions across there. We want very smooth internal rounded structures, and then that nice sharp defined margin makes that margin very clear. And we don't want any beveling at all towards that periphery either. We want sort of that nice strong butt margin. This is what gives a lot of that vertical resistance. Be careful interproximally of not nicking the adjacent teeth. And then I'll usually use a fine diamond to smooth some of these. Again, all of this I typically do under isolation. Most of the time with an isolite. Occasionally a dental dam is used, but most of the time I'm doing it under isolite. And then you'll go and just lightly round those internal angles so they're not sharp at all. Doesn't have to be dramatic, but it just definitely needs to be smoothed. This part I might need to take out the isolite for a little bit. Just make sure you control where that burr's going. And once I've smoothed that, I'll typically put the isolite back in. Try to maintain that isolation as much as possible. Prevent any issues with the tongue, and then prevent any issues with possibly losing the burr. inhalation or aspiration or anything, or swallowing. At this point, I do still frequently grab my hand instruments after this. See, I use the side of that hatchet. We all know the end of that Navy hatchet has been dull for like a decade, but those sides are still really quite sharp, and it's really quite nice to just brush it a few times just to smooth up any rough surfaces that got away from me. It really doesn't take much either. Even my dull hatchet here makes pretty short work of it, especially in that big broad surface, and you can push pretty firmly against it. Pretty hard to damage anything, but on here I'm just having fun at this point, because really it's a very fast preparation. I think I've got this at like 1.1 speed for most of it. That's really about it. And then I'm just touching some things up. Again, you can do this all with any type of polishing type burr. And that's pretty much preparation. Quite straightforward. You can see why I like it.